When we dive into the complexities surrounding that fateful Christmas morning and night, it's clear there's more than just a straightforward timeline or simple family dynamic at play. Maybe it's the very nature of family, full of love, contradictions, and hidden tensions, that creates a puzzle we struggle to piece together. If we look closely, we might find the roles that each family member played are layered with meaning and sometimes conflicting narratives. And that's the tricky part. What seems like a loving, normal family can also be a stage where dark motives and psychological undercurrents hide in plain sight. What's also interesting is how small moments, like Burke waking the family, bedtime negotiations, or simple I love you exchanges, become charged with significance when viewed through the lens of forensic analysis and psychology. It's funny how those everyday actions, the rhythms of routine life, can carry such weight when tragedy strikes. These moments offer clues not just about what happened, but about how people think, feel, and relate to each other under pressure. Remember, in cases like this, the ordinary often masks the extraordinary, and understanding the psychology beneath the surface can be just as important as any physical evidence. And what might be worth noting is the complex role of narrative, how the family's story, public perception, and investigative framing interact and sometimes conflict. The way John and Patsy position themselves in Burke influences everything from how the case is investigated to how the public understands it. It's a reminder that truth is often wrapped in layers of emotion, memory, and strategy. So in this analysis, we're going to walk through a series of questions that explore these themes one by one, unpacking motivations, behaviors, psychological framing, and forensic implications to get a fuller understanding of what may have happened that night. What did John Ramsey say to Burke during Christmas morning while opening presents? On Christmas morning, the air was filled with anticipation. According to the death of innocence, the children, including Burke, bounded into their parents' room, shouting, "Come on, wake up, it's Christmas." Burke himself chimed in, exclaiming, "Yeah, we got to see what Santa brought for us. Hurry up." John Ramsey, in his 2001 December deposition, remembered this as the kids bounding into our room that morning, excited to open their presents. Following their normal tradition, John went downstairs first to turn on the Christmas tree lights, creating a sense of anticipation for the children. He kept them waiting in the bedroom a little while to heighten the fun. Once the lights were on, the whole family, dressed casually in their pajamas and robes, descended to the living room where the Christmas festivities took place around a big tree. Patsy Ramsey, in her 1997 April interview, noted that they passed out presents slowly. John, in his 1998 June interview, mentioned that Burke received a bike, as he thought they had 3 bikes there that year. While the sources don't record specific verbal exchanges between John and Burke during the present opening itself, the overall tone conveyed is one of excitement and a cherished family tradition, orchestrated by John to build anticipation for the children. What did John say to Burke during breakfast on Christmas morning? After the presents were opened, the family typically enjoyed a special breakfast. In his 1998 June interview, John Ramsey stated that they usually have a breakfast, which we did, I think, that day afterwards. He speculated that it might have been pancakes, which was their usual choice, possibly accompanied by bacon and hash. Patsy Ramsey confirmed in her 1998 June interview that they would have eaten pancakes together at that table on Christmas morning. This breakfast consumed most of the morning. While no specific conversations between John and Burke during this meal are detailed in the sources, the impression is of a shared traditional family time following the Christmas morning excitement. How did John and Burke interact after returning from the airport on Christmas Day? Later on Christmas Day, John Ramsey spent several hours at the airport around 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., tending to his airplane and loading presents for their upcoming trip to Charlevoix. He returned home around 3 p.m. Upon his return, John, in his 1998 June interview, recalled some kids around and kids were playing. Patsy Ramsey elaborated in her 1997 April interview that the Colby kids and some other little new kids who had moved nearby were over, and many were playing Nintendo in Burke's room. While John was at the airport, Patsy was busy wrapping gifts downstairs and packing suitcases for the trip. After John's return, the family began getting ready to go to the Fleet White Christmas dinner party. Patsy typically handled getting the children ready, which was described as an effort because they wanted to dress up. The interaction between John and Burke during this time seems to have been within the context of Burke playing with friends and the family preparing for their evening outing. Okay, so let's first think about Burke waking everyone up on Christmas morning with that classic burst of excitement. "Come on, wake up. It's Christmas. We got to see what Santa brought us." It's a moment packed with that genuine childhood energy, right? But what's interesting here is how Burke isn't just excited for himself. He's trying to get everyone else moving, including JonBenet. That raises a little question. Was Burke maybe playing a bigger role in shaping JonBenét's experience of Christmas, maybe even influencing her belief in Santa Claus. Older siblings often take on that kind of emotional leadership within families, and if Burke was nudging JonBenet along, that adds a layer of relational dynamics worth thinking about. And we can continue to think about how this plays into the family ritual itself. The whole idea of Christmas morning as a shared performance where everyone has a role. Burke's pushing to wake everyone could be his way of asserting some control or responsibility within the family system, especially on a day as special as Christmas. From a criminological point of view, understanding these family roles can be crucial because it tells us who might be emotionally invested or even stressed by the rituals, which could feed into later behaviors or conflicts. On the same topic, it's worth looking at the atmosphere of the morning. Everyone in pajamas and robes, a cozy, relaxed vibe that Patsy's photo helps confirm. That image of JonBenet snug in her pajamas, Patsy in a robe, paints a picture of normal family warmth. But from a logical perspective, this setting establishes a baseline of calm and safety. So if something later deviates from this calm, it stands out all the more sharply. It also gives us clues about the family's trust and routines, which are important when piecing together timelines. And we can also think about Patsy's parenting style, as revealed by her leaving the kids playing upstairs unsupervised while she wraps gifts downstairs. That degree of trust in children's self-regulation is significant. From a forensic framing angle, moments of unsupervised time can be critical gaps, potential windows when events could unfold without adult oversight. But psychologically, it also reflects a certain parenting philosophy that values independence, which complicates assumptions about control and supervision. Now, moving to the breakfast details, it's fascinating how the family reportedly ate pancakes, bacon, and hash, a hearty traditional meal, but forensic evidence shows only pineapple in JonBenet's system. This mismatch is a key physiological clue. To break it down simply, our digestive systems process foods differently, and forensic toxicology can detect specific food residues and estimate when they were consumed. The presence of pineapple alone suggests JonBenet ate something different or at a different time than the rest of the family, which could hint at separate feeding or an altered routine that morning. This technical point is often overlooked but is critical in establishing timelines. Think of it like a biological timestamp. Pineapple enzymes linger in the system in a way that forensic scientists can detect precisely. So the absence of other breakfast foods in JonBenet's system pushes us to reconsider what she ate and when, possibly even when the last normal interaction with her family was. Along these lines, it's also funny, or maybe telling, how something as simple as breakfast foods becomes a forensic puzzle piece. It reminds us that in investigations, small details often carry heavy weight. What might seem mundane at first glance can shift the entire understanding of events when combined with other evidence. And when we dive deeper into the psychological and philosophical aspects, the morning's calm, trust-based environment seems to set up a paradox. On one hand, the family appears close-knit and affectionate. On the other, those moments of unsupervised autonomy might create cracks or vulnerabilities in the household's protective shell. That tension between warmth and risk is something criminology often grapples with, how normal family dynamics can unwittingly open the door to tragedy. Finally, to get inside the mind of the killer at this moment, imagine observing this cozy, trusting scene. The killer has to navigate a home filled with anticipation and familial closeness, a place where children are relaxed and parents engaged in rituals. From a criminological perspective, this setting might heighten the killer's need for control, stealth, and precision. They'd be aware that any disruption could alert the family, so timing and psychological insight into these rituals would be crucial. Understanding these layers, the family's warmth, the children's roles, the subtle cracks in supervision, and the forensic timing clues, helps us build a nuanced picture of Christmas morning. It's a moment rich with meaning, one that sets the stage for everything that follows. Okay, so let's first think about Burke waking everyone up that Christmas morning, shouting, "Come on, wake up, it's Christmas, we gotta see what Santa brought us." That's not just a kid excited about presents. That's a kid actively trying to get the whole family moving, especially pulling JonBenet along. Now, if we consider the sibling dynamic here, it's pretty common for an older sibling to take on the role of emotional leader or motivator in a family. Burke's urgency could reflect that role, not just his excitement, but his influence over JonBenet's participation in the morning's rituals. That kind of influence might also speak to how family narratives like the Santa myth get passed and reinforced between siblings. And we can continue to think about how this emotional leadership affects family cohesion. Siblings often share stories and rituals that become part of their shared identity, and Santa is a perfect example of that. Burke reminding everyone about Santa might have been a way to reinforce a comforting family myth, something to keep the magic and excitement alive. Psychologically, these rituals aren't just about gifts, they're about bonding, creating emotional safety, and shared meaning. And if Burke played a central part in that, it tells us about his place in the family's emotional hierarchy. Along the same lines, it's worth considering how Burke's role might shape the way JonBenet perceived that morning and the day ahead. If Burke was the one keeping the momentum going, maybe JonBenet was more passive, or maybe she relied on him emotionally. That dynamic can be important when you're trying to understand how each sibling experienced the day differently. Philosophically, it brings up ideas about power, dependency, and agency within family relationships, which can influence behavior and memory. And we can also think about the relaxed atmosphere the family was in. Everyone in pajamas and robes, the classic image of a cozy Christmas morning. Patsy's photo with JonBenet on her lap in pajamas confirms this casual vibe. From a deductive reasoning perspective, a calm, safe environment sets a baseline. If things were normal and loving then, deviations later become more significant. Physiologically, a relaxed state can influence how people react to stress and trauma later. So this morning mood is a useful point of reference. What might be worth noting too is Patsy's comfort letting the kids play unsupervised upstairs while she wrapped gifts and packed downstairs. This shows a parenting style that allowed autonomy and trust in the children's ability to manage themselves, at least briefly. From a forensic framing standpoint, these moments where direct supervision lapses are crucial because they create windows where events could happen unseen. Explaining this in layman's terms, imagine a parent trusting their kids to play in another room while they focus on chores. It's normal, but it also means things can happen without immediate adult notice. And that ties into the technical concept of supervision gaps in child safety and forensic investigations. A supervision gap means a moment when adults aren't actively monitoring children, which can be important when reconstructing timelines or determining when and how incidents occurred. It's not necessarily negligence, but for investigators, these gaps must be mapped and understood to piece together events accurately. Now, getting inside the mind of the killer, imagine observing this family. The relaxed morning, kids playing, parents busy but trusting. That familiarity and routine might be seen as vulnerability. The killer could use those gaps and routines to their advantage, timing moves for moments when attention is divided. Psychologically, this requires patience and cold calculation, knowing when the house's defenses are down. What's also interesting is how the trust and warmth in this morning scene contrasts so sharply with what happens later. It forces us to think about the chilling nature of violating a space that feels safe and loving. Philosophically, it's a deep betrayal, not just of people, but of the very idea of home as sanctuary. And this betrayal becomes part of the criminal's psychological profile, someone who manipulates trust for control and harm. So when we pull this all together, Burke's role in waking the family, the sibling emotional dynamics, the parenting style, and the killer's perspective form a complex web. It's not just about what happened, but about understanding the emotional and behavioral context, the rhythms and vulnerabilities that set the stage for everything that follows. Okay, so let's first think about the family atmosphere and parenting style on that Christmas morning. The picture we get is one of relaxed comfort. Everyone in pajamas and robes, kids free to play upstairs while Patsy was downstairs wrapping gifts and packing. That casualness tells us a lot about how the parents managed their household. It wasn't a strict, highly controlled environment. It was one where trust and autonomy were given to the children. And when you think about that, it makes sense in the context of the family's lifestyle and dynamics. And we can continue to think about how that trust and autonomy might have influenced the kids' behavior. When children know they have some freedom and the trust of their parents, they tend to feel more secure, but also take on more responsibility for themselves. Psychologically, that can foster independence, but also means they are less closely monitored at times, which in forensic terms becomes important when trying to piece together timelines and movements. Along the same lines, it's worth considering that Patsy's decision to let the kids play unsupervised while she focused on chores isn't unusual in family life, especially during busy holidays. But from an investigative perspective, those moments create potential gaps in supervision that could be exploited by an intruder or lead to accidents going unnoticed. Explaining this in layman's terms, it's like when a parent leaves the room for a few minutes. It feels safe, but is enough time for something unexpected to happen. And in addition to that, the casual family environment, kids playing in different parts of the house, parents occupied with their tasks, shows a rhythm of life that is normal but complex. From a logical standpoint, such rhythms can create blind spots for investigators trying to reconstruct exact events, especially in a house as large as the Ramseys. The physical layout and division of activities mean that family members weren't always in direct contact. What might be worth noting is how the parenting style, permissive and trust-based, might have affected the children's responses later in the investigation. Kids raised with more autonomy sometimes have fragmented memories or perceive boundaries differently, which can influence how they recall traumatic events or interact with investigators. And when we think about technical terms, this parenting approach relates to what psychologists call authoritative permissiveness, a style balancing warmth and freedom, but sometimes lacking strict boundaries. While it encourages independence, it can also mean less supervision and more variability in behavior, which forensic experts have to consider when evaluating testimonies and timelines. Now, getting inside the mind of the killer again, imagine someone familiar with this household rhythm. The killer would know that the parents aren't hovering constantly, that the kids have space to move and play freely. That creates opportunities to exploit moments of lower vigilance. Psychologically, it requires cold patience and observation to understand when the house's defenses are down and to act accordingly. What's funny about this is that such a trusting and warm family environment, which should be protective, ironically creates vulnerabilities. It's a cruel paradox that the very things that make a home loving can also open it up to harm. Philosophically, it challenges our assumptions about safety and the nature of trust within families. So when you pull all this together, the family atmosphere and parenting style aren't just background details, they shape the dynamics of that day and night. They affect how the children behave, how the parents respond, and how the killer plans and acts. Understanding these rhythms helps us see the case in a fuller, more human light. Okay, so let's first think about the breakfast scene on Christmas morning, which at first glance might seem like just a normal family meal. The reports say pancakes, bacon, and hash were served, classic comfort food for a holiday breakfast. But then we get to the forensic evidence, and things get a lot more interesting. Only pineapple was found in JonBenet's system, not the other breakfast foods. That discrepancy immediately raises questions about what actually happened that morning and when. And we can continue to think about how forensic experts use food and digestion as a kind of biological clock. It's actually pretty fascinating how different foods metabolize and leave traces in the body at different rates. For example, pineapple contains enzymes that break down proteins in a certain way, and these enzymes and their metabolites can be detected and timed in forensic toxicology. So when investigators find pineapple but not heavier foods like bacon or pancakes, it suggests that JonBenet ate something different or at a different time than the rest of the family. This helps them narrow down the timeline of her last meal and potentially the window when something happened. Along the same lines, that timing isn't just a cold scientific fact. It has big psychological and investigative implications. If JonBenet's last known food intake was distinct from the family's, it might mean she was separated or isolated at that time, or that something interrupted her routine. From a criminology point of view, these clues help build a picture of opportunity and control, who had access to her and when. And in addition to that, it's also interesting to think about how mundane details, like what a child ate, become so crucial in forensic investigations. It's a reminder that in criminal cases, small details can become key pieces of evidence that either support or contradict narratives. Philosophically, it shows how everyday life intersects with tragedy in unexpected ways. What might be worth noting is Patsy's role that morning, too. While the kids played unsupervised upstairs, Patsy was downstairs wrapping gifts and packing. That division of attention shows how even in moments of normalcy, supervision wasn't constant. In layman's terms, it's like when a parent is busy in one room and the kids are in another. Usually harmless, but from a forensic view, these moments can be critical. And technically speaking, the concept of supervision gaps is important here. These are times when caretakers aren't actively watching children, which can be windows of opportunity for accidents or crimes. Investigators map these gaps carefully to understand when and where things might have happened. Getting inside the mind of the killer again, they would be attuned to these supervision lapses. The killer might plan their actions around moments when attention is divided, when parents are occupied and children are relatively unsupervised. Psychologically, that requires patience, timing, and a cold calculation that contrasts sharply with the family's warmth. And lastly, when you pull all these details together, the breakfast scene isn't just a meal, it's a forensic puzzle piece. The food JonBenet ate, the supervision patterns, the family's routines, and the killer's observations all intersect to create a timeline and behavioral map that's vital to understanding the case. It shows how seemingly small and ordinary moments can have profound implications when looked at through the lens of forensic and psychological analysis. What was their interaction like in the car on the way home from the Fleet White party? The Ramsey family departed the White's party between 8:30 p.m. and 9 p.m., as John Ramsey recalled trying to get Burke to bed at a reasonable hour upon their return home. According to JonBenet forensic files, they arrived home around 10 p.m. During the car ride, Patsy Ramsey, in her 1997 April interview, noted a distinct difference between the children. JonBenet was sound asleep and crashed out the whole time, while Burke did not fall asleep and was still wanting to play. They made a couple of stops on the way home to drop off Christmas gifts for the Walkers and the Steins. John Ramsey, in his 1998 June interview, stated that at the Walkers' house, he believed he, Patsy, and Burke all stayed in the car. At the Steins' house, Patsy went in, and John didn't recall if Burke did, though it wouldn't have been unusual for Burke to go in because that was his buddy Doug. They then debated going to the Fernies, but decided against it as it was 15 minutes away, and the children were tired and had been up all day. Their priority was to get home and get to bed. The decision reflects John's consideration for Burke's exhaustion and the need for him to rest before an early departure the next morning. How did John and Burke behave when they got home after the party? Upon arriving home, JonBenet was sound asleep in the car. John Ramsey, as stated in his 1998 June interview and JonBenet forensic files, carried her from the car to her second-level bedroom. Burke, however, was still active and still wanting to play. Patsy Ramsey recalled in her 1997 April interview that she didn't remember exactly what Burke did, but thought maybe he and John were fussing with something, a toy he wanted to put together or something. John Ramsey clarified this in his 1998 June interview, stating that he started to get Burke into bed, but found him sitting in the living room working on a toy, an assembly little toy he got for Christmas. He described it as some kind of little square car elevator. I don't know, it was something only a child would appreciate, but it was like a car garage repair thing, elevators run up and down and stuff, little micro cars. Recognizing that Burke was not going to go easy to bed, John sat down and helped him put it together to try to expedite the process. This joint effort took 10 or 20 minutes. This interaction shows John's patient and accommodating approach to getting Burke to wind down and prepare for bed. What did John say or do when putting Burke to bed on Christmas night? After helping Burke with his new toy, John Ramsey said that Burke went up to bed. John helped Burke get into his pajamas, a routine he performed every night. Burke would then brush his teeth and climb into bed, specifically his normal bed, which was the one closest to the door in the TV room. John estimated in his 1997 April interview that he probably got Burke to bed somewhere between 9:30 p.m. and 10 to 10, probably a quarter to 10. In The Other Side of Suffering, John Ramsey recounted a tender moment during this bedtime routine, saying to Burke, "You're a good son, Burke. I love you." This statement highlights a loving and affectionate interaction between father and son. How did Burke respond to John during the bedtime routine? In response to John's affectionate words during bedtime, Burke replied, "I love you too, Dad." This simple exchange further emphasizes the mutual affection and normalcy of their nightly routine. What were the last things John said to Burke before leaving his room? The last recorded words from John Ramsey to Burke before leaving his room on Christmas night were, "You're a good son, Burke. I love you." Burke's reply was, "I love you too, Dad." After this, John felt a sense of contentment, knowing his children are safe in their beds and that it had been a Christmas to remember before he himself went to bed. Okay, so let's first think about this idea of John trying to get Burke to bed at a reasonable hour. It sounds simple, but when you really start thinking about it, it opens up some interesting possibilities. Maybe Burke was just being a typical kid, full of energy, especially on Christmas night when excitement is running high. Kids often resist bedtime as a way to hold on to the day's fun, and parents have to negotiate with that energy. But if we look through a more deductive lens, that phrase reasonable hour could also hint at a struggle. Maybe Burke wasn't settling down easily and John was working to keep some order. That subtle tension, if it existed, sets a tone for the family dynamic at that moment. And we can continue to think about what that says about parenting style. John and Patsy reportedly had a more permissive, trusting approach, letting the kids play unsupervised, not enforcing strict discipline. In that context, it makes sense that bedtime might be a negotiation rather than a firm rule. That kind of parenting fosters independence, but also means children can push boundaries more easily, especially on special occasions like Christmas. From a physiological standpoint, children's sleep needs vary, and excitement or anxiety can delay sleep onset, so resistance at bedtime might be quite natural. Along the same lines, it's worth considering the implications of a relaxed parenting style during a time of increased family stress. Holidays can be both joyful and chaotic, and parenting that's usually permissive might tighten up or become more challenging under stress. That might explain why John specifically mentions trying to get Burke to bed at a reasonable hour, suggesting that the usual routines were strained. In forensic framing, these moments matter because they shape the environment in which events unfold. And in addition to that, think about the emotional needs that might underlie a child resisting bedtime. Psychologically, children often use bedtime as a time to seek attention or control, especially if they're sensing changes or tensions they don't fully understand. Burke's resistance could be a subconscious way of coping with underlying anxiety or uncertainty, which adds depth to interpreting his behavior that night. This makes the bedtime scene more than just a routine. It's a small window into the family's emotional state. What might be worth noting too is how this bedtime struggle fits into the timeline of events. John was the only one who had to be up early the next morning to fly the plane, so theoretically, the rest of the family could have stayed up later without issue. So why the emphasis on Burke's bedtime? That focus might be a clue to parental concern or an attempt to position Burke as a challenge or focal point in the family narrative. And it's also funny when you think about how this focus contrasts with later accounts. John and Patsy say Burke slept through the night, but Burke himself recalls being awake during the chaos. That discrepancy is a classic example of conflicting witness statements that forensic experts have to untangle. Trauma, memory distortion, or narrative shaping can all play roles, making it harder to reconstruct the true sequence of events. From a technical perspective, forensic psychologists use specialized interviewing techniques to assess reliability of children's memories, especially when trauma is involved. Understanding how memories can fragment or be influenced is key to weighing Burke's statements against his parents. This complexity adds a layer of challenge to understanding the bedtime and nighttime events. And lastly, getting inside the mind of the killer, imagine watching this scene, a father negotiating bedtime with a resistant child, the household routines winding down, but still a layer of unpredictability. The killer would need to time their actions carefully, aware that even small disruptions could derail their plan. Psychologically, this speaks to the patience and cold calculation required, moving through a home filled with life and emotion, finding that moment to strike. So when you put all this together, the bedtime struggle and parenting style aren't just background details. They reveal the emotional rhythms and tensions of the family, which the killer would have understood and exploited. This moment, small as it seems, becomes a critical piece of the complex puzzle of that night. Okay, so let's first think about these discrepancies in sleep and awareness accounts. How John and Patsy said Burke slept through the night, but Burke himself remembers being awake during the screaming and chaos. At face value, that's a pretty glaring contradiction, right? But if we dig into the psychology of trauma and memory, things get more nuanced. Trauma can distort memory, especially in children, who might remember events in fragments or suppress parts that are too painful. So these conflicting accounts might not be simple lies or cover-ups, but reflections of how trauma affects recall. And we can continue to think about how memory works under stress. Forensic psychologists talk about state-dependent memory, which means people often remember things better when they're in the same emotional or physical state as when the event happened. If Burke was frightened or disoriented, he might recall some moments vividly and others not at all, while his parents, not experiencing the trauma firsthand, perceive the night differently. That explains how two truthful perspectives can seem contradictory. Along the same lines, it's worth considering how adults might unconsciously shape narratives to protect themselves or their children. Saying Burke slept peacefully could be a way for John and Patsy to preserve a sense of normalcy or to shield him from blame or trauma. That doesn't necessarily mean intentional deception. It could be psychological self-protection or denial, which is common in families facing tragedy. And in addition to that, these discrepancies pose a real challenge for forensic framing. Investigators have to carefully weigh all testimonies, understanding that memory isn't a perfect recording, but a reconstructive process influenced by emotions, time, and suggestion. Technical approaches like the cognitive interview help elicit more accurate memories, but even then, some inconsistencies remain. What might be worth noting is how these conflicting accounts affect the timeline and the investigation's direction. If Burke was awake during the night, he could have witnessed or heard crucial events, making him a key eyewitness. But if he was asleep, that changes his role entirely. So understanding these discrepancies is vital for reconstructing what really happened. And it's also funny how these memory contradictions mirror the human struggle with trauma and truth, how people want to remember and forget at the same time. This human complexity makes forensic work both fascinating and frustrating because absolute certainty becomes elusive. From a technical standpoint, understanding the neurobiology of trauma shows us that stress hormones like cortisol can impair memory formation or cause fragmented recollections. In layman's terms, when someone's scared or traumatized, their brain doesn't store memories neatly. It's more like a shattered mirror, with pieces scattered and sometimes missing. Now getting inside the mind of the killer again, Knowing these discrepancies exist might make them more confident or cautious. A killer aware that children might or might not be awake has to plan carefully. The unpredictability of witnesses is a big risk. Psychologically, that could influence how and when they acted, adding layers to their mindset. So, putting it all together, these sleep and awareness contradictions aren't just minor details, they strike at the heart of the investigation's reliability and the complex human factors at play. They remind us that memory and trauma are intertwined, shaping the narratives we use to understand crime. Okay, so let's first think about how the way the family frames the narrative around Burke's bedtime and behavior affects the whole timeline we try to piece together. When John emphasizes getting Burke to bed at a reasonable hour, it sets up a story that Burke was the focus of the evening's effort, maybe the one who needed the most attention or was hardest to settle. But what's interesting is how this framing subtly shifts attention away from JonBenet, who was the central figure in the tragedy. That shift might influence how we understand the sequence of events that night. And we can continue to think about how this narrative framing influences investigators and public perception. When Burke is portrayed as the restless child who needed managing, it positions him as separate from the rest of the family's experience, almost like a side character in the unfolding drama. This could affect how his statements are received and how his involvement or awareness is interpreted later on. From a deductive reasoning standpoint, the way a narrative is framed can shape the questions investigators ask and the leads they pursue. Along the same lines, it's worth considering how this framing aligns with the reported timeline. The family leaving the party early to get Burke home, and in bed, JonBenet reportedly asleep at the party or on the way home, and the focus on Burke's bedtime struggle. This sequence creates a kind of scaffold around the critical hours leading up to the crime. But if the underlying assumptions are questioned, the entire timeline could shift. And in addition to that, this framing might serve psychological purposes for the family, consciously or unconsciously. Placing Burke as the one needing attention that night could be a way to protect JonBenet's memory or to simplify a complex, painful story. Philosophically, this reflects how families manage trauma narratives, selecting and emphasizing parts to create coherence and reduce pain, even if it complicates factual accuracy. What might be worth noting is that narrative framing isn't just storytelling, it has real forensic consequences. The timeline constructed from these narratives guides investigative resources, witness interviews, and even legal strategies. If the timeline is skewed by selective emphasis, critical details could be overlooked or misunderstood. And it's also funny how human memory and storytelling naturally favor certain narratives, often shaped by emotional needs rather than strict facts. This is why forensic investigators must always approach narratives critically, balancing empathy with skepticism. From a technical angle, narrative framing can be seen as a cognitive bias, where people unconsciously highlight information that supports their view and downplay conflicting details. Understanding this bias is key for investigators trying to get to the objective truth amid subjective accounts. Now, getting inside the mind of the killer again, narrative framing and timeline are crucial for them too. If the family's story positions certain children as asleep or unaware, the killer might count on that to avoid detection. The way the family portrays the night could influence the killer's risk calculations and confidence in their plan. So when we bring all this together, narrative framing and timeline implications are not just background details, but active forces shaping the investigation. They influence what is remembered, reported, and pursued, affecting how the crime is understood and eventually resolved. Were there any notable conversations or moments between John and Burke throughout the day? Several notable moments characterize John and Burke's interactions. One in Christmas morning excitement, as noted, Burke's eager participation in waking his parents for presents, and John's playful delay in turning on the lights set a cheerful traditional tone. Playtime. After presents, Burke played with his new toys, including Nintendo, often with other children in his room. John's later help with Burke's new assembly toy indicates his involvement in his son's play and a desire to see him enjoy his gifts, even if it meant delaying bedtime slightly. On Friendship with Whites, John noted that Fleet White and Burke were buddies. While at the Whites' party, the children played together, much in consideration for tiredness. The decision to forego dropping off gifts at the Fernie's house was explicitly due to the children, including Burke, being tired after a long day, showing John's attentiveness to his children's well-being. Nightly routine. John consistently stated that he helped Burke with his bedtime routine, including getting into pajamas, which he described as like I do every night. This consistency suggests a stable and involved father-son dynamic. How would you describe the tone of the interactions between John and Burke from Christmas morning until bedtime? The tone of the interactions between John and Burke Ramsey from Christmas morning until bedtime can be described as loving, affectionate, patient, and routine-bound. In morning, the interactions were marked by the excitement and joy typical of Christmas morning, with Burke eager to open presents and John facilitating this by adhering to family traditions like turning on the lights. When daytime play, while John was away at the airport for a portion of the day, when he returned, the atmosphere was relaxed, with Burke engaged in playing with his new toys and friends. In evening and bedtime, the journey home and bedtime showcased John's patience and care. Despite Burke being tired but still wanting to play, John engaged with him, helping him assemble a new toy to ease the transition to bed. The explicit exchange of I love you statements underscores a deep and openly affectionate relationship. John's reflections on his children being safe in their beds and the day being a Christmas to remember suggest a sense of contentment and fulfillment from a parent cherishing his family. The consistent nightly routine, as described by John, also implies stability and predictability in their relationship. Okay, so let's first think about this idea of the likability narrative and how John and Patsy frame Burke and themselves as essentially good, likable people who shouldn't be scrutinized. When families face public and legal pressure, it's natural for them to want to protect their image. Saying things like Burke is a likable and prudent kid or emphasizing John and Patsy as caring, responsible parents creates a protective shield. This narrative can shape how outsiders perceive them and often aims to build sympathy or trust. From a logical and deductive standpoint, it's important to recognize this as a common psychological and social defense mechanism, and we can continue to think about how this narrative influences the investigation and public discourse. Likability, while important socially, is not evidence of innocence or guilt. However, forensic work and criminology emphasize objective facts over character judgments. The danger lies in allowing personal impressions, like he seems likable or they seem like good parents, to influence investigative rigor or public opinion. This is why investigators must separate the human side of a family from the cold, hard evidence, even when that's emotionally difficult. Along the same lines, it's worth noting the psychological underpinnings of why likability matters so much in narratives like this. People tend to trust those they like and feel they know. This is tied to the halo effect, a cognitive bias where positive impressions in one area spill over and affect judgments in other areas. It's fascinating how human cognition works this way, and understanding it helps us see why families and their supporters work hard to project a positive image. And in addition to that, from a philosophical and criminological perspective, the likability narrative can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it humanizes people who might otherwise be reduced to suspects or statistics. On the other, it risks overshadowing objective truth by appealing to emotion rather than fact. This tension is at the heart of many criminal investigations, especially high-profile ones. It reminds us that truth-seeking must balance empathy with critical analysis. What might be worth noting, too, is how this narrative also serves as a way to push back against law enforcement and public suspicion. John and Patsy, expressing frustration about not being given the benefit of the doubt, reveals a defensive posture. They want recognition as good people caught in a nightmare, not as potential suspects. This dynamic can complicate investigations as families become less cooperative or more guarded out of fear or resentment. And it's also funny how this likability narrative often plays out in media and public opinion. The more likable someone appears, the harder it is for the public or authorities to accept their involvement in wrongdoing. This phenomenon is seen repeatedly, where charm and persona can obscure darker realities. Forensic science exists to cut through those facades by focusing on physical evidence and facts. From a technical explanation standpoint, when investigators assess a case, they look at confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that confirms existing beliefs. If someone is widely seen as likable and trustworthy, confirmation bias can make it harder to objectively evaluate contradictory evidence. Explaining this in layman's terms, it's like wanting to believe the nice person you know couldn't possibly do something bad, so you unintentionally overlook red flags. Now, getting inside the mind of the killer in this context, consider how such a likability shield could be frustrating or even threatening. A killer hiding behind a facade of likability might manipulate that image to evade suspicion. Psychologically, maintaining that public persona requires constant control and performance. For a criminal, managing both private and public identities can be a source of stress, but also a tool for deception. So when you put all this together, the likability narrative is more than just image management. It's a psychological strategy, a social defense, and a complicating factor in forensic investigation. It influences how evidence is received, how stories are told, and how justice is pursued, and recognizing its power helps investigators and the public approach cases with a balanced and critical mindset. Okay, so let's first think about this idea of vocalized affection, those moments where John tells Burke, "I love you," and Burke responds in kind. On the surface, it's just a sweet, normal exchange between a father and son. But when we dig a little deeper, especially given the context, it starts to take on more significance. This kind of explicit, repeated vocalizing of love can serve as a powerful psychological signal, not just within the family, but also to the outside world. It paints a picture of warmth, closeness, and a strong bond, which can act like a protective shield or a force field around Burke. And we can continue to think about how this force field functions emotionally and socially. By emphasizing Burke's special place through these affectionate exchanges, the family is essentially building a narrative of innocence and protection around him. This can subtly influence how others perceive Burke as a cherished child, perhaps above suspicion or criticism. Psychologically, it helps establish an emotional boundary, making it harder for outsiders to question his role or behavior. It's interesting how vocal expressions of love can be both genuine and strategic. Along the same lines, the selective nature of this affection is worth considering. While John is openly affectionate with Burke, there's little mention of similar vocal warmth directed toward JonBenet or Patsy at those moments. That imbalance raises questions about emotional dynamics within the family. Is Burke being singled out for special protection? And if so, what might that say about family relationships or attempts to shape public perception? Philosophically, it touches on how love and attention are not always evenly distributed and can carry symbolic weight. And in addition to that, from a forensic framing perspective, this vocalized affection can function as a kind of narrative tool. By publicly highlighting the loving relationship between John and Burke, the family might be trying to preempt scrutiny or suspicion. It's almost like saying, look, here is proof of normal family love. There's nothing sinister here. This tactic can be powerful. But it also requires investigators to look past emotional signals and focus on objective evidence. What might be worth noting, too, is how these affectionate moments relate to broader patterns of memory and testimony. Children who feel loved and protected might be less likely to be seen as perpetrators or even as key witnesses. This protective framing can influence how Burke remembers events or how his role is perceived by others. It's a reminder that emotional context shapes not only relationships, but also the construction of narratives and investigations. And it's also funny how love, which we usually think of as a pure and simple thing, can be layered with complexity in situations like this. Vocal expressions of affection can comfort and reassure, but they can also be wielded, consciously or unconsciously, to manage impressions. That dual nature of love makes forensic and psychological analysis both fascinating and challenging. From a technical explanation standpoint, when psychologists talk about attachment theory, they describe how early emotional bonds shape behavior and memory. Strong, vocalized affection, like what John shows Burke, suggests a secure attachment, which generally correlates with healthier emotional outcomes. But attachment can also influence how children cope with trauma and what they recall about stressful events, which is critical for understanding testimony. Now, getting inside the mind of the killer, this vocalized love and protection around Burke might have been a barrier or a complicating factor. A perpetrator aware of such a force field might feel frustration or urgency to circumvent or exploit it. Psychologically, the killer might see the public affection as a kind of mask or defense they need to penetrate, adding layers to their planning and mindset. So when we bring all this together, the vocalized affection and psychological force field around Burke are not just family warmth, but active elements shaping perceptions, memories, and the investigation itself. They remind us that emotional expressions carry weight far beyond the personal, influencing how stories are told, understood, and believed. Okay, so let's first think about these narrative gaps and how the family's storytelling shapes the picture of unity they present. John's narrative highlights a perfectly loving family, kids safe in their beds, love flowing freely, and no cracks showing. But what's interesting is what's left unsaid. The absence of details about interactions with JonBenet at bedtime or affectionate moments with Patsy. These gaps aren't just missing pieces, they're active parts of the story the family is choosing to tell, shaping how outsiders see them. Philosophically, this selective storytelling reflects how families manage trauma by constructing narratives that preserve identity and cohesion, even if it means glossing over complexity. And we can continue to think about how these gaps influence forensic and investigative perspectives. When parts of the story are missing or minimized, It complicates efforts to get a full picture. Investigators rely on comprehensive accounts, and when affection is only highlighted toward one child or when the routine is sketched only in broad strokes, it leaves room for doubt and speculation. Deductively, these narrative omissions become clues in themselves, suggesting what might be uncomfortable or hidden. Along the same lines, it's worth considering the psychological need for the family to present a united front. Trauma often drives people to emphasize solidarity and downplay conflict to protect themselves and each other. This nothing to see here approach can be a defense mechanism, but also creates a barrier for objective truth finding. Forensic framing has to navigate this carefully, recognizing the human impulse for preservation without losing sight of factual inquiry. And in addition to that, these narrative gaps can affect memory formation and testimony. When a family consistently frames their story around unity and love, individuals may internalize that version, consciously or unconsciously shaping their memories to fit. This psychological framing complicates distinguishing between genuine recall and reconstructed narrative, which is a central challenge in forensic psychology. What might be worth noting, too, is how the lack of affectionate detail toward JonBenet contrasts sharply with the vocalized love for Burke. This selective warmth might suggest emotional complexities or imbalances within the family, which are masked by the overarching story of unity. That dissonance invites deeper analysis of family dynamics and relational patterns, and it's also funny how these narrative gaps are common in many families facing trauma. The story told publicly is often the polished one, while the messy, complicated parts stay hidden. This human tendency to protect family reputation can inadvertently obscure vital truths that investigations need to uncover. From a technical perspective, understanding family systems theory helps explain how families maintain equilibrium by controlling narratives and roles. Gaps and silences are part of that system, serving to manage anxiety and preserve cohesion, but sometimes at the cost of transparency. Now, getting inside the mind of the killer, these narrative gaps and the emphasis on unity could either frustrate or embolden them. A killer observing a tight, loving family might feel pressure to conceal their actions more carefully, or conversely, they might exploit assumed solidarity to avoid suspicion. Psychologically, the killer must navigate both the public narrative and private realities, adding layers to their behavior and planning. So when we pull this all together, the narrative gaps and psychological framing of family unity are not just background context. They actively shape how the case is understood, how memories are formed, and how justice is pursued. Recognizing these patterns is key to seeing beyond surface stories and approaching the truth with clarity. As a point of discussion, we consider the kind of person who would carry out a crime like this, someone with a very particular mindset, motivations, and methods. This isn't just about violence, it's about control, intent, and a psychological game that plays out in the shadows of a family's life. When we consider the details, the timing, the family dynamics, the targeting of JonBenet rather than Burke, it tells us that the killer had a very specific plan and purpose, one that's deeply personal and calculated. And we can continue to think about how this killer might view their enemies. If the primary grievance is with John Ramsey, as some theories suggest, then why target JonBenet? From a logical standpoint, going after the patriarch directly seems more straightforward, but choosing JonBenet introduces layers of psychological complexity. It suggests the killer wanted to send a message that struck at the heart of the family's identity, maybe inflicting pain where it would hurt most emotionally. JonBenet was the child, the vulnerable link, and attacking her could be seen as the ultimate way to undermine John. Along the same lines, the choice to spare or avoid Burke raises important questions. Burke was awake, nearby, and seemingly accessible. If the killer had a stun gun or other means to keep him quiet, why wait for him to go upstairs? This delay is puzzling and suggests the killer was very intentional in not harming Burke, or at least in not harming him immediately. That could indicate a protective impulse, a strategic choice, or a psychological boundary the killer wouldn't cross. It complicates the narrative and challenges assumptions about opportunity and intent. And in addition to that, we can consider how the killer's psychological profile intersects with their methodology. They needed to be patient, observant, and precise, waiting for the right moment to act. Psychologically, this speaks to a person who is calculating and possibly enjoys the control and power dynamic involved in invading a home and manipulating family members. The method, using a stun gun, timing events, reflects a cold, clinical approach rather than impulsive violence. What might be worth noting is how the killer's intent shapes their perception of the family. They may see John as the primary adversary, but target JonBenet as the emotional fulcrum. This means the killer's mind is working on multiple levels, practical and symbolic. Understanding this duality is key to unpacking motivations. And it's also funny how this calculated targeting conflicts with the chaotic and contradictory narratives from the family. While John and Patsy project unity and innocence, the killer's mindset is one of disruption and control. This clash highlights how crime can shatter family illusions, revealing unseen tensions. From a technical perspective, profiling such a killer involves looking at both behavioral patterns and psychological drivers. Traits like narcissism, desire for control, resentment, and possibly a grudge against John emerge as possible motivators. But the killer also has to navigate risk, which explains the methodical timing and selective targeting. Now, thinking about the killer's view of JonBenet, she represents more than just a child. She embodies the family's future, hopes, and identity. Psychologically, harming her sends a message of dominance and destruction that resonates far beyond the immediate act. It's a profound way to attack someone indirectly by destroying what they love. And we can continue to think about why Burke might have been spared or avoided. It could be due to practical reasons. Maybe he was too unpredictable, or the killer didn't want an additional witness. Or psychologically, maybe the killer had limits or even some twisted protective feelings toward him. This selective violence reveals much about the killer's internal boundaries and motivations. Along the same lines, the question of why the killer waited for Burke to go upstairs if they had the means to quiet him earlier is crucial. It suggests a high degree of planning and patience, but also hints at possible emotional or psychological constraints. This waiting game might reveal the killer's need to maintain control over the timing and sequence of events, avoiding unnecessary noise or complications. And in addition to that, we can consider the impact of the family's routines and interactions on the killer's plan. The permissive parenting, the kids' freedom to play upstairs, and the parents' divided attention might have created the environment the killer needed to operate smoothly. The killer was exploiting not just physical access, but the emotional rhythms and lapses in supervision. What might be worth noting here is how the killer's psychological motivations might intertwine with practical considerations. Revenge against John could be mixed with a desire to dominate through symbolic destruction, while also carefully managing risk by avoiding harm to certain family members. This complexity makes the crime deeply layered and not easily reducible. And it's also funny how all these pieces, family dynamics, parenting style, timing, and selective targeting, seem to fit together like a puzzle. But when you try to explain the killer's exact motivations, contradictions and gaps emerge. It's a reminder that human psychology and criminal behavior are messy and multifaceted. From a forensic framing perspective, understanding these motivations helps investigators prioritize leads and interpret evidence. But it also cautions against oversimplifying or assuming one clear motive. The killer's intent may be multiple and conflicting, requiring nuanced analysis. Finally, getting inside the mind of the killer, we see a person driven by complex emotions, resentment, desire for control, maybe jealousy or rage, who carefully orchestrates their actions to maximize impact while minimizing risk. Their focus on JonBenet rather than Burke or John directly reveals a strategic and symbolic choice, turning the family's love and vulnerability into a weapon. So, when we pull all of this together, motivations, psychology, and methodology converge to paint a picture of a deeply calculating, emotionally driven individual. Understanding who this person might be, their mindset, their objectives, their limits, is essential to making sense of the crime and the contradictions that surround it. So, when we pull all of these threads together, what emerges is a rich and complicated tapestry. The motivations, behaviors, and psychology of those involved weave through family dynamics, forensic facts, and investigative narratives in ways that defy simple explanation. Maybe the killer's mindset reflects not just rage or revenge, but a calculated manipulation of trust and vulnerability, targeting JonBenet to send a message that's both deeply personal and cruelly strategic. What's funny about all this is how the pieces fit and don't fit at the same time. The family's warm affections and careful narratives contrast starkly with the cold, calculated actions of the killer. This tension makes understanding the crime a challenge, one that requires balancing empathy with critical analysis, emotions with facts. It's a sobering reminder that beneath the surface of any tragedy lies a complex web of human motives and behaviors. And finally, it's worth noting that this case pushes us to think deeply about the interplay between family trauma and justice, how narratives are shaped, how memories are formed, and how investigations unfold, all these factors matter profoundly. If we keep this complexity in mind, we can approach the truth not as a simple story, but as a multifaceted reality that demands both compassion and rigor. And with that being said, as always, I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe if you haven't. And until next time, take care of yourself.